Trigger warning, this episode contains mentions of death and mature themes. Viewer discretion is advised. In the winter of 169 AD, the most powerful man on Earth was sitting in a freezing tent on the battle frontier, covered in mud and surrounded by slaughtered fighters. Rome was collapsing. A plague was killing 2,000 people a day in the capital. The economy had crashed. Marcus Aurelius, sitting in his tent, was facing multiple existential crises. He had just buried his co-emperor. He was watching his own children die. By all accounts, the fabric of his life was falling apart. Death had become so vivid. Collapse of his empire around the corner. Marcus Aurelius was an avid journaler, which later were sold as books titled The Meditations. On one cold evening, with his journal lit by a torch, he dipped his pen in ink and wrote a single sentence that became his lifeline, which is paraphrased as follows: "Death smiles at us all. All one can do is smile back." Today on Gut, we have a case study on survival and a whole host of things going wrong for Mr. Aurelius. We're going to deconstruct the mind of a man who stared into the abyss and smiled. Act 1. The Ledger of Loss. When Marcus was maybe 6 or 7, the Emperor of Rome, Hadrian, noticed him. He and Hadrian were distantly related, but it's still odd that the Emperor noticed a child. Something about Marcus stuck with him. The Roman historian Cassius Dio says Hadrian saw exceptional strength of character in the boy. Which, what does that mean at age 6? I've met a lot of 6-year-olds, and exceptional strength of character isn't always the phrasing that comes to mind. What the sources actually describe is that Marcus couldn't lie. Pathologically, he could not lie. Even about stupid things that children tend to lie about. Even when lying would have been easier. He was simply honest. Since Marcus and Hadrian were distantly related, and Hadrian had no sons to inherit the throne, seeing potential in the boy and wanting to honor his previous heir, Hadrian employed a 2-part adoption scheme. First, Hadrian adopted a 51-year-old man, Antonius Pius, who was then instructed to adopt Marcus and Hadrian's own grandson, Lucius Verus, effectively placing them on the imperial layaway. Marcus then waited 23 years on the sidelines. 23 years learning the job, watching how it worked, sitting at Antonius' side while decisions got made. Antonius died March 7, 161, and then the throne belonged to Marcus. But he didn't want it. Sources say he had to be compelled to take the throne. Some say he wept. You could read that as humility, about the feasts that will be held in his honor, the financial spoils that will be coming to his family. But when you take into account everything, remember, Marcus was 40 years old at this point. He'd spent 2 decades watching emperors work up close. He knew what the job actually was, beyond the feasts and parties. He knew the mental turmoil that came with it, the decisions that have no good answer, the trade-offs that leave someone ruined no matter what you choose, and how it grinds down those who hold the throne. He was walking into a meat grinder and knew it. Within weeks of Marcus taking the throne, Rome became destabilized. The Tiber River flooded, which then destroyed Rome's grain stores, and this led to famine. Before there's time to figure out his own people starving to death, the word comes from the east. The Parthians invaded. Rome's sponsored king in Armenia has been overthrown, and the whole eastern frontier is on fire. Marcus needed to think quickly and send an army, but he couldn't go himself. Rome was a mess. So he sent his co-emperor, his adopted brother Lucius Verus, to handle it. Side note, Marcus asked the Senate to have a co-emperor, which had not been done before, and some historians say that this was a strategic move to prevent Lucius from plotting his death so that he could take the throne himself. Lucius Verus. He's an interesting character because he's basically the control group in this experiment. He's in the same blended family as Marcus. They got roughly the same education and had the same Stoic tutors, same access to philosophy, same training for leadership. And when he gets to Antioch to run the Eastern campaign and save Rome's border from imminent invasion, he throws parties. Lucius is gambling, feasting, sampling the local entertainment. There was an actual war happening in the background, which the generals handled. Lucius was busy. Meanwhile, Marcus is in Rome, working himself to the bone, managing a famine. Marcus and Lucius are under the same circumstances and same call to responsibility. They have the same access to resources. Completely different responses. We will come back to this. The generals win the war on the eastern border, absolutely no thanks to Lucius. And in 166, Lucius comes back to Rome in triumph, bringing with him a terrible gift. The soldiers returning from Mesopotamia were carrying a disease, probably smallpox or measles. The Romans called it the Antonine Plague after Marcus's family name. It spread through the army and the cities, and then everywhere. Cassius Dio says 2,000 people were dying per day in Rome at its peak. The death toll across the empire was probably 5 million people, which was 10% of the population, gone. Not enough workers to farm, not enough soldiers to defend the borders. Carts hauling bodies out of Rome around the clock. After the wars and plague, Rome's financial reserves were on the brink of bankruptcy. Marcus needed money, desperately, to pay the army, to fund relief efforts, keep the whole thing from collapsing completely. Emperors would normally raise taxes in this situation and squeeze the provinces, take from people who wouldn't fight back. But Marcus wouldn't do it. Instead, and this still kind of blows my mind, he held an auction of his family's own belongings as a sort of fundraiser for Rome itself. In the Forum of Trajan, the center of Rome, Marcus sold off imperial treasures, golden goblets, crystal, paintings by famous artists, his wife's silk robes embroidered with gold thread, family heirlooms going back generations. And then, after the crisis passed, he offered to buy it all back from anyone who wanted to return their purchases. Something about that detail sticks with me that really shows Marcus Aurelius's character. He was one of the most powerful people in the entire world, and yet he offered a fair trade on the other end of crisis. He didn't have to offer refunds. Nobody would have expected that. But he kept doing the unexpected. January 169, Lucius Verus dies. He was 38. Marcus is alone now, sole emperor of the empire that is struggling to keep it together. And then there's one thing that we haven't discussed until now. Between becoming emperor and his own death, Marcus buried 8 of his 13 children, and eventually, his wife. I want to be careful here because we don't have detailed records of each death. Roman infant mortality was horrific. A lot of infants didn't make it past their first year. Some of Marcus's children lived longer. There was a son named Marcus Annius Verus, born 162. He was named Caesar at 7 years old, groomed to be co-emperor alongside his brother Commodus, which is a name that is likely familiar to you. He died at 6 during surgery to remove a tumor behind his ear. Marcus writes about this in his journal. Not publicly. This was private, never meant to be published. He's trying to reason his way through it. He writes, "One man prays, 'How may I not lose my little child?' But you must pray, 'How may I not be afraid to lose him?'" Marcus Aurelius is showing us how he is attempting to live through the lens of Stoicism. The plague weakened Rome's borders. Germanic tribes up north, the Marcomanni, the Quadi, the Sarmatians, started raiding across the Danube. They saw an empire on its knees and figured it was time to push. Marcus had to respond, and between his scholarly writings, philosophical study, time spent with books and tutors, he at this point knew very little about military strategy. But in 168, Marcus left Rome. He went to war for the first time in his life. He would then spend most of the last decade of his life in military camps on the Danube, living in tents, cold, mud, disease, death, all of it. Commanding armies he'd never been trained to command. Act 2. Fire feeds on obstacles. This is the period where he wrote the Meditations, a personal journal that remains the gold standard for applied Stoicism. The text is enduring because of its vulnerability and deep humanity. It documents Marcus's daily battle to cultivate resilience in the face of failure and death. He relied on core Stoic principles, like non-judgment and radical acceptance, specifically the idea that one should not merely endure their fate, but learn to love it, regardless of the hardships involved. I think people imagine Marcus writing philosophy in a nice library somewhere. Marble columns, good lighting, maybe some wine. No. He wrote it huddled by a campfire in what's now Austria, surrounded by dying and dead soldiers, in the middle of a war that seemed like it would never end. His children dead or dying back in Rome, his own body beginning to fail. He wasn't writing philosophy for publication. He was writing notes to himself, just trying to hold it together. The Meditations and the books that comprise it were never meant to be a bestseller. We don't even know what Marcus called it. The title was later added by editors. Some ancient references call it To Himself, which is more accurate since he is mostly arguing with himself in the pages. And honestly, if you read it expecting polished wisdom, you're going to be disappointed. It's repetitive. He comes back to the same ideas over and over, different angles, different phrasings, like he can't make them stick. And that's because he couldn't. That was the whole problem. Marcus had read all of the Stoic texts. He could recite Epictetus from memory, and he knew the philosophy cold. And yet all that knowledge wasn't helping him manage his day job. He writes at one point, "Throw away your books. Stop letting yourself get distracted." He's not telling us, the reader, to stop reading. He's telling himself. He's realized that the theory that he studied for decades is practically useless to him right now. He's shivering in a tent. He's surrounded by death. The empire that he is CEO of is burning. So the Meditations become more like a workout journal. He needs practice, daily drills. He's doing reps, saying, "When you wake up in the morning, tell yourself, the people I deal with today will be meddling, ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, jealous, and surly. Never value anything as profitable that compels you to break your promise, lose your self-respect, hate any man." How easy it is to push away every impression that is troubling. Over and over, he writes these phrases, the same exercises. And he's not writing revelations here, he's really just drilling it into his waking consciousness. There's a line from the Meditations that became itself a best-selling book by Ryan Holiday, and it goes, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." So intuitively, we think about obstacles being between us and what we want. If there's a wall between us and our goal, you either have to go around the wall, go through it, or break down the wall entirely. Marcus Aurelius is saying something completely different and counterintuitive. He says, the wall is what you want. The obstacle is the curriculum. Managing the plague, staying calm while thousands died, finding money without crushing the poor, that was his job. That was being emperor. The deaths of his children weren't interruptions to his life, they were his life. The question wasn't how to avoid grief, the question was, what kind of person am I becoming while grieving? The frozen military camp wasn't keeping him from philosophy, it was where philosophy happened. The Meditations could not have been written in a library. That book required suffering. Marcus puts it another way. He writes, "Fire feeds on obstacles." Whatever's trying to destroy you is fuel if you can figure out how to use it. And for most of us, that is a big if. And aside about Lucius Verus, our beloved co-emperor and party boy, I keep coming back to him because he's so useful when we frame up Marcus's actions and thought processes. Same family as Marcus, same tutors, Same access to Stoic education. Same circumstances. Different outcome. When the pressure came, Lucius reached for pleasure immediately. Marcus, instead, reached for his notebook and said, "We must avoid the ways of the rich." Marcus may have been a more naturally introspective person than Lucius, and then he certainly became better practiced. He performed endless reps of self-reflection, worked out his mind in the mental gym. He built something with that, over years. So then when catastrophe came, he had something to draw on. Lucius knew the philosophy of Stoicism, but there's little evidence to suggest that he ever practiced it. I should probably say Marcus wasn't a saint, and without flaws. The meditations reveal his problems, not his victories. He writes constantly about managing his temper, about not snapping at people. He writes about not wanting to get out of bed. Probably because when he got out of bed, he was waking up in an active war zone for years. When you rise unwillingly in the morning, let this thought be present. I am rising to the work of a human being. That is not exactly a man leaping up to seize the day. He's trying to convince himself not to pull the covers over his head, which we have all felt. And he made huge mistakes. Namely, his son Commodus was designated heir, the same Commodus who'd become one of Rome's worst emperors and marked the beginning of the end of the empire. Commodus fought as a gladiator, which was a very low thing for an emperor to do. He also made sure to fight injured opponents in the ring, so he knew he could win, because apparently he wasn't a great fighter either. He declared himself a human god, but also was extremely insecure. He was nothing short of a disaster. Historians have argued about this forever. How could the philosopher king have such a blind spot for his own kid? My understanding is this: Marcus had no choice. The Roman system demanded a blood heir when you have a son that's living, unlike Hadrian, who did not, and Commodus would have had to have died, like his older brothers, for him to not be the emperor. And if Marcus Aurelius decided to adopt someone else to then take Commodus's place, that likely would have signed a death warrant for that other emperor because it would have been rejected by the Roman society. Some historians also think that Marcus could not see Commodus clearly. Parents often can't. Regardless, as Marcus Aurelius shows us, wisdom is not perfection. Philosophy didn't save Marcus from every mistake. It gave him a framework for trying, a floor below which he tried not to fall. And when he fell anyway, it gave him a way to get back up. Spring 175. Marcus is exhausted. He's been fighting Germanic tribes for years. His health is getting worse. Out in the eastern provinces, a rumor begins to spread. The emperor is dead. But it's not true. News traveled slow back then, and verification traveled even slower. A general named Avidius Cassius hears the rumor and makes a decision. Cassius was one of Marcus's best commanders. He'd won the Parthian War. He'd crushed the rebellion in Egypt. He controlled the entire eastern half of the empire. When he heard Marcus was dead, he declared himself emperor. By the time he learned the truth, that Marcus was still alive, it was too late. He had committed treason, and there was no walking it back. So now Marcus returns to Rome. You're Marcus. What are you thinking? Answer for yourself for a moment. Your trusted general, a man you relied on for years, a close friend, just tried to steal your throne. Your court is panicking. Everyone wants to know who else was involved in this treasonous act. People are calling for blood for all those who were involved. What do you do? Marcus addressed his troops, and the speech, as Cassius Dio recorded it, is strange. He doesn't sound enraged. He doesn't call Cassius a traitor. He calls the rebellion a tragedy of fellow soldiers. He sounds more sad than angry. And then he says something wild. He says if the empire would be better served by Cassius, he'd step aside willingly. he won't start a civil war for his own ego. Small caveat, this speech is a reconstruction/approximation, but the actions that followed are well documented. Marcus then gathered his army and marched east. Before he got there, Cassius was killed by his own soldiers and his head was brought to Marcus. Instead of basking in the win of the demise of his latest enemy, in a rare move, Marcus refused to look at it, ordered it buried, giving the head some dignity. And again, he did something that nobody expected. Cassius, in his rebellion, had correspondence with others. There were letters and documentation. A rebellion like that doesn't just happen by one lone ranger. There were co-conspirators, senators who would pledge support, generals who'd hedge their bets to be on the right side of history. There were rumors about his wife Faustina even being involved, though historians mostly dismiss those. The letters would have named names of who his new enemies were. Marcus could have read them and known exactly who'd betrayed him and then cleaned out the house. But instead, Marcus Aurelius had the letters burned without reading them. Sources say he didn't want to know. He said, and I'm paraphrasing here, that he didn't want to be contaminated by vengeance. If he knew who the conspirators were, he might be tempted to punish them. He might spend the rest of his reign looking over his shoulder. So he chose not to know. I think about this a lot. We live in a time where we can know almost anything. People today are quick to dispose of others, especially when they find out their political beliefs differ. Every bit of data, every piece of information is available at our fingertips, and we've convinced ourselves that more knowledge is always better. Just ask your friends who can't stop reading the news. But here, 2,000 years ago, Marcus is saying sometimes information is poison. Sometimes knowing hurts more than not knowing. He could have read those letters, purged everyone who'd even thought about betraying him, those who were extremely close to him. He would have then spent the rest of his years paranoid, suspicious, and jumping at shadows. Instead, he burned the evidence, let the conspiracy die, and got back to work. Act 3. The Sun Setting. Marcus survived the betrayal, toured the eastern provinces to calm things down, then went back to the Danube. The Germanic wars dragged on. They'd actually drag on past his death. His son would end them by really just giving up and going home. By 177, Marcus was clearly getting ready for the end. He made his son Commodus co-emperor with himself, gave him full authority in an attempt to have a smooth succession. In early 180, somewhere near modern Vienna, Marcus got sick again. Fever, couldn't eat, pain. The doctors thought it was the plague catching up with him. He took about 6 days to die from there. The ancient accounts of those last days are quite detailed. His friends and advisors gathered round. Commodus was there. Though Marcus apparently kept him at a distance, he didn't want anyone accusing his son of hurrying things along. You'll notice here this is where the story significantly differs from Gladiator. At one point, Marcus lost consciousness mid-sentence. Everyone thought that was it. His children started sobbing. When he came back to life and saw them crying, he didn't comfort them. He corrected them. Don't weep for me. Think about the common death of all men. Even dying, he couldn't stop teaching. Or trying to. Night of March 17th, 180 AD. Marcus looked at those around him and said, "Go to the rising sun, for I am already setting." Then he turned over, like he was going to sleep. And that was it. He was 58 years old. He'd been emperor for 19 years. He left behind an empire still standing, barely. A son who'd ruined most of what he'd built, and a leather journal full of notes to himself about how to be a decent person. The rising sun. Historians have debated what he meant. Was it about Commodus? About wisdom? A metaphor? We'll never know. So what do we do with this? Marcus went into a hole. War, plague, betrayal, burying most of his children. he didn't come out the same person. But he didn't come out bitter, even though he likely experienced significant mental anguish throughout his time as emperor. We don't have evidence to say that he came out cruel. He came out as what later generations would call the philosopher king, a man whose private notebook became one of the most read books in history. There's a temptation to make this sound automatic, like suffering just magically transforms you into a better person. It does not. Plenty of people go through terrible things and come out destroyed, or mean, or broken in ways that never heal. What made the difference for Marcus was what he did while he was down there. The practices, the daily drills, the mental gym, the willingness to keep asking, what is this situation demanding from me? What can I learn here? A general curiosity about his waking moment. He built a mind that could take the worst and then turn it into something useful. Not by being an unfeeling person. The meditations are full of grief and exhaustion and anger, but by insisting over and over that his response was still his to choose. He did not have automatic emotions making choices for him. What stands in the way becomes the way. There's not always a reason for struggle. Struggle is not always a gift. What I will say is that we all must respond to struggle and challenges. The only question is whether you pick the response or let it be selected for you. Marcus picked for himself. Every morning, every night, through 20 years of catastrophe. Not perfectly, not without anger or despair, but persistently, showing up for himself. The man who became one of the greatest emperors of all time went into a hole as a reluctant philosopher who'd read too many books for his age. The man who came out was something else entirely. Near the end of the meditations, there's a passage that reads like goodbye. You have lived as a citizen in a great city, 5 years or 100. What's the difference? The laws make no distinction, and to be sent away from it, not by a tyrant or a dishonest judge, but by nature who first invited you in. Why is that so terrible? Like the actor who exits the stage when the director dismisses him, but I've only played 3 acts. Yes, in your life, 3 acts is the whole drama. Go then in peace, for the one who lets you go is at peace with you. Go to the rising sun. The work continues. This has been Gut. I'm Christiane. Thanks for listening. I'd like to thank Stephen West at Philosophize This. He had a great episode which I used in my research. Go check him out. Please like this episode, subscribe, and leave a rating on your platform of choice. See you next week.